We're sewing up another free pattern today. This is the York top by Seamwork. You can find this PDF pattern at seamwork.com. I've left a link for you below so you can check it out. This top comes together quickly. It's a simple design with back neck ties and cuff slit details. The fabric that I'm using today is 100% cotton floral print available at threadymade.com. I've left a link to this fabric below so you can check it out, as well as the rest of their collection of wovens and knits. I hope you sew along with me, so grab your materials and let's get started. Here are my two back bodice pieces. Before I sew them together, I want to finish the edges of both center backs separately. I'm going to be using my serger. Now that my center back edges are finished, I'm going to place my back pieces right sides together. And I'm going to start pinning them together from the dot marked for my pattern piece and continuing to the bottom of the garment. Sew from the dot to the bottom of the garment with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, backstitching at both ends to secure. After I sew that portion, I'm going to press the entire 5/8 inch seam open from top to bottom. So here I've pressed the entire seam open, also pressing those 5/8 inch seam allowance on either side of the top slit. Now I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and sew close to my serging stitches all around the slit, pivoting at the bottom opening of the slit to come back up the other side along those serging stitches. Now for the front bodice piece, I went ahead and transferred my darts from my pattern piece onto both sides of the bodice. Fold the dart in half, pinning through one dart leg and out the other. Doing this for both darts. Now that my darts are pinned, I'm going to sew along my transferred lines from the outside edge to the point, leaving thread tails at the point so I can tie them in knots. And then press those darts downward. Now, just as I did for my center back edges, I finished the edges of my shoulders separately. I've done this for my front piece and my back piece. Now I'm going to place my front and back pieces right sides together and pin my shoulder seams. Then I'll sew both shoulder seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Now to prepare for attaching the sleeve to the bodice, we're going to sew basting stitches from one side of the sleeve to the other. Right about at the top of the underarm curve, we're going to sew basting stitches all along the sleeve cap until we get to the top of the curve on the other side, leaving thread tails on both sides so that we have threads to pull for easing. I'm going to be using the longest stitch on my machine and about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, doing this for both sleeves. Now with my bodice pieces opened out flat, I'm going to place my sleeve right sides together with the armhole, making sure that my single and double notches align with the single and double notches of my bodice. First, I'll match the notch at the top of my sleeve to my shoulder seam and pin in place. Then I'll match and pin the ends of my sleeves. Now I can start pulling the basting stitches to get a perfect fit from the underarm seam to my shoulder notch. Once everything aligns nicely, go ahead and pin that section in place. Then I can start pulling the basting stitches on the opposite side of the shoulder seam, fitting it and pinning it in place. Now that the sleeve is pinned in place, I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and then serge my seam to finish. Once you've finished your sleeve seams, go ahead and press them toward the sleeve. For the side seams of the bodice and the side seams of my sleeve, I've gone ahead and finished them with my serger. So from the bottom of the garment to the bottom of the sleeve, those seams are already finished. I've done this for both sides of the bodice and the sides of the sleeve on both sides of the garment. Now I'm going to place the front and back bodices and their sleeves right sides together. And I'm going to pin the sides of the bodice and the sides of the sleeve together, making sure to align the underarm seam. Now I'm ready to sew from the bottom of the garment to the bottom of the sleeve in one continuous seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Doing this on both sides of the garment and then pressing your seams open. Now for the cuffs, we're going to fold each cuff right sides together and pin the short edges. Then sew the short edges together with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Once those are sewn, trim your bottom sewn corners, and then turn your cuffs right side out, poking out each corner. And give both of your cuffs a good press. Now we're going to take both cuffs to the sewing machine and edge stitch close to those sewn edges with about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, leaving those bottom unsewn edges open for now. Now that I have the cuffs top stitch along those 3 edges, I'm going to base the bottom open raw edges for both cuffs with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. At the bottoms of both of your sleeves, you have dots indicating where we're going to be placing the short ends of the cuffs. I've marked that dot here with a pin. Now I'm going to place my cuff right sides together with the bottom of the sleeve, aligning the raw edges. I'm going to place one short edge of the cuff at my pin and start pinning in place. Continue pinning all the way around until the opposite short edge of the cuff meets the pin on the other side. Now that the cuff is pinned all the way around, and the short edges align at the top where your dot was, we're ready to sew the cuff in place all the way around with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Doing this for both cuffs. So I'm going to sew both of these cuffs in place and then serge my seams to finish. Now that our cuff is sewn and serged, we can open out that seam. And we're going to top stitch just above the seam that we just sewed with about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way around. As you're top stitching, you're going to be catching that seam allowance. This way, the seam allowance on the inside will stay nicely oriented up and away from the cuff. Do this for both cuffs. For the neckline binding, we're going to be using 1/4 inch double fold bias tape. You can use a store-bought version or you can cut your own bias tape from your main material. From one end of my bias tape, I'm going to measure and mark 12 inches. Now starting at that 12-inch point that I marked, I'm going to start binding the neckline. So with the folds of my bias tape completely opened out, I'm going to place the bias tape and my main material right sides together and place that 12-inch mark at the back opening slit and start pinning in place. I'm going to pin my binding in place this way all around the neckline until I'm back at the opening slit on the opposite side. Now that I've attached the binding all around the neckline and I'm back at the opposite side of the slit, I'm going to measure 12 inches away from the back of the slit on this side as well and trim off the excess bias tape beyond that. Now we're going to sew the binding in place all around the neckline from back slit to back slit, following the top crease of your bias tape, which should be about 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. Now for the tail ends of our bias tape, we're going to fold those ends so that they're right sides together, just folding it in half so that the long raw edges meet and pin in place. Then we're going to sew those short edges of the bias tape on both sides with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once those ends are sewn, turn those ends right side out, poking out those corners. Now we can start encasing that neckline seam. The main seam allowance that we sewed earlier should be pressed up toward the bias tape. Take the outer raw edge and fold it along its outer crease, which should be about 1/4 of an inch. Then we're going to take that folded outer edge of the bias tape and fold it to our stitching line. so that that folded edge now just covers the stitches. And pin in place all the way around. And for the tails that extend beyond the neckline, we're going to encase those seam allowances as well, tucking in those outer edges of the bias tape and then folding the bias tape in half. So now only the right side of your material shows and you have a clean folded seam here. And pin in place. Then starting from one end of the tail, we're going to edge stitch along those folded edges, continuing to edge stitch along those folded edges along the neckline, straight across until you're back at the end of the tie on the opposite side. The hem allowance for the bottom of the blouse is 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to take it to the ironing board and press it to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch all the way around. Now that I have that bottom raw edge folded to the wrong side, I'm just going to do a rolled hem here. I'm going to take the raw edge of the garment and fold it to the crease that I just made with my iron, and then fold it on the crease and pin in place. Continue rolling and pinning all the way across. Now that I have my hem pinned in place all the way around, I'm going to edge stitch close to this inner fold all the way around. Give everything a nice final press and your blouse is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Feel free to check out the rest of my video library on this channel, and I'll see you in the next sew along.